What's up, guys? Hello to Footballtalk here, back at it again with more off-season content. After extensively talking about the individual players and the classes put together by teams in the NFL draft, along with outlining the most improved position groups across the league last week, I wanted to go back to poking some holes into these rosters, or rather talk about one area of each team that I believe they should still be looking to address. You're not going to find a franchise quarterback or star pass rusher at the end of June. However, one more piece to your offensive skill position group, a role player in a defensive back 7, or depth pieces in the trenches could still be added and ultimately be key for those teams as the season rolls around. We'll start with the NFC once again and go through each of the 4 divisions, explaining my reasoning for the spot or unit I end up choosing, with a quick look at the depth chart and analysis of what certain roles entail. For some teams it may be a glaring need for a starter, while for others we're mostly looking at finishing touches that are supposed to insulate them for injuries. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to check out my divisional draft and roster review series, where I broke down every single pick made by all 32 NFL teams, laid out what role they would fulfill for the new squad, and discussed the classes as well as their approach to roster construction as a whole. Let's get into this one now though, and we'll start off with the NFC North, and the first team here is the Chicago Bears. For them I put down true edge rusher by getting back DJ Moore from the Panthers as part of the trade down from a number 1 overall pick as a primary target in the pass game, and ultimately selecting Tennessee's Daniel Wright to shore up the right end of the offensive line. Chicago has surrounded Justin Fields with the pieces necessary to take another step in year 3 on the center. Defensively, they've now surrounded Eddie Jackson with 4 second-round picks to build out that secondary and invested substantial financial resources into the linebacker corp of Tremaine Edmonds and TJ Edwards in this year's free agency class. In terms of the defensive line, they bring back Justin Jones for one more year, who's coming off his most productive season rushing the passer, but also probably his worst in run defense, and handed Andrew Billings another 1-year prove-it deal for $2.8 million, coming off the best season of his career in Las Vegas as a mobile nose tackle. Otherwise, I thought they reached on a couple of mid-day 2 picks on the interior in Jervin Dexter from Florida and Zach Pickens from South Carolina, who I don't believe either is actually ready to perform well in the pros yet. And shockingly, they haven't really invested any legit resources into the edge position. They did bring in DeMarcus Walker and Rasheem Green as alignment flexible guys up front, who are both most effective sliding inside on passing downs. So in terms of actual edge rushers, Travis Gibson is the only somewhat proven commodity. Dominic Robinson had some pretty good success as this undersized finesse designated pass rusher that they gambled on the 5th round last year. Yet I don't see anybody else with a proven track record who can truly win the corner of consistency. Moving on now to the current favorites to win the North in the Lions, there's a lot of reason for optimism in Detroit, especially after I named them twice in my write-up from last week on the most improved position groups this offseason. We'll have to see how exactly that defense comes together, which went from Swiss cheese early in 2022 to an average unit over the second half of last season, once they started taking the ball away and changed the personnel usage a little bit. Offensively, they already finished top 6 respectively in DVOA and EP per play. Jared Goff, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamal Williams all had career years, while I actually explained why I thought they upgraded the backfield since then. However, I believe the 2 biggest reasons for the success on that side of the ball this past season were the services of Ben Johnson calling plays, who they surprisingly were able to bring back, and what I believe is one of the top offensive lines in the league staying largely healthy. Halapoulivaati Vaitai missed all season due to needing back surgery at the eve of week 1, but Evan Brown was available for all but 3 games, and both the starting tackles literally played 100% of the snaps. My worry is about what they have behind those guys. Since being drafted by Seattle in 2016, I've said that Jermaine Fetty isn't somebody you want playing extensive stretches on the edge for you. He's never received a PFF grade above 62 across his 7 seasons in the NFL when playing the right tackle position, and he's never switched sides. To me, he's an okay backup option at guard. Otherwise, the Lions only have Matt Nelson and Obinna Eze. Proof of the former not being a solution is how much of a weak link that right tackle spot was when pressed into action in 2021, and Eze has yet to play an NFL snap as an undrafted free agent from last year. For the Packers, I put down backup quarterback. The Pack are making the monster switch on the center, going from 30 years of first ballot Hall of Fame play to a guy with 83 regular season pass attempts since shockingly being drafted at the end of the first round 3 years ago. I think generally the public is underrating the support system around Jordan Love, looking at a defense that really found its strides over the latter parts of the past season, one of the better 2-headed backfields in the league, and an offensive line that should be better if David Bakhtiari starts looking more like his former self, Elgton Jenkins now finally being back as natural spot inside, and some of the young guys taking a step whilst having some option in case of injury. The one area where it's more so about the lack of experience is the receiving corps, where Josiah DeGuara is the most seasoned player among the entire crew, and you haven't really been able to create a role for him through 3 years in Green Bay. So looking at some of the signs that Love has shown in preseason, and jumping in late in a couple of games this past year, there's certainly reason for optimism. However, if he ends up missing any extended stretches, their season may go completely sideways, looking at the alternatives that they have in-house. Danny Edeling has yet to attempt a single pass since being drafted in the 7th round back in 2018, and frickin' Sean Clifford, as the 149th pick this past draft, was the one that had my jaw on the floor. I think for anybody who's watched him at Penn State over the last 4 years, even if you may appreciate the toughness and pure arm strength, the idea of this guy having NFL accuracy or decision-making qualities is just wild to me. Wrapping up the North now with the Minnesota Vikings, and for them I put on a proven commodity in the secondary. You can't really fault them for not addressing a position group, considering over the last 4 years, they've now invested 8 picks across the first 4 rounds of the draft into that unit, along with bringing on veteran Patrick Peterson on a couple of one-year deals, and this offseason signing Byron Murphy to a 2-year, $17.5 million contract. They probably moved on from P2 at the right time, entering his 13th NFL season after he provided some key turnovers for them recently. They do have plenty of bodies back there now, but other than Harrison Smith, another one of those guys at the twilight of his career, and Murphy, you're looking at all players that are either still on their rookie deals or were cut from the teams that originally selected them during those. I was a big fan of both the second round picks last year in Lewis Cine and Andrew Booth Jr., but they combined for just 107 regular season snaps due to injury. I'm guessing Booth is in the driver's seat for one of those starting spots on the outside, and the plan with Murphy should be to put him back into the slot. So now it'll be up to 4th rounders from this last 2 years in a Caleb Evans and Mekhi Blackman from USC to compete for the 3rd spot. Yet, if there are any injuries, you're looking at the potential of a bunch of inexperienced players contributing major snaps in a system that needs really smart guys who understand tendencies, have great route anticipation, and know when they can drive on stuff, especially with Brian Flores taking over defensive coordinator with as much cover zero reign as he typically wants to run in passing situations where they're asked to play off-man coverage across the board and make great decisions. Let's head east now and start things off with the Dallas Cowboys, and for them I put on power back, and I feel a little dirty almost for this being my pick for Dallas here, since I've been a number one supporter of Tony Pollard getting the majority of touches in that offense, but I didn't mean to say that they should just cut ties with Ezekiel Elliott and not address the running back position at all otherwise. By taking Brandon Cooks' contract off the nearby Texans' hands, everybody on the O-line coming back, and then replacing Dalton Schultz with 2nd round pick Luke Schoonmaker from Michigan to reorganize that almost indistinguishable 3-headed tight end room, this offense stays largely intact, if not really even improved personnel-wise. The question mark is the change of play caller, as the Cowboys and now Chargers offensive coordinator Kellen Moore supposedly mutually parted ways, with 25-year veteran assistant Brian Schottenheimer assuming that title, and headman Mike McCarthy designated to call the shots. Whether that really has a chance of being an upgrade is rather doubtful from my perspective, but if Dak Prescott's interception luck can regress towards the mean in a positive sense, this could certainly be a top 10 offense in EPA per play for the 3rd straight season. With that being said, this has been a 2-back system throughout, even though I thought the touches weren't distributed appropriately, and that's what McCarthy has run for the majority of his career. While Zeke had his shortcomings in terms of quick twitch explosiveness at this stage of his career, he was still an excellent decision maker between the tackles, and valuable in short yardage situations in particular. Yet Malik Davis had 0 goal line touches as an undrafted free agent last year, and Ronald Jones is a less refined and probably even less dynamic version of Zeke at this point, especially with Pollard coming off the broken fibula he suffered in the divisional round against San Francisco. Someone to smash it up the middle in those spots and who can help them grind away games late, along with providing solid pass pro, would make sense here. Next up we got the New York Giants, and I think they could still use a rangy safety. After bringing back almost all the names from the skill position group and adding the profiles of Pro Bowl level tight end Darren Waller and Tennessee speed demon Jalen Hyatt as a 3rd round pick, the pieces are starting to actually fit together and are overhauling what kind of roles those guys are about to assume. That should help Brian Dable and Mark Kafka to not constantly have to create schematic advantages for them through the air, and gives them a flexibility of what they can do in the first place. Defensively, last year's 5th overall pick, Kayvon Thibodeau, flashed in a way that has me confident he could turn himself into a force off the edge. The G-Man quietly added some underrated pieces on the interior line, and swapped out the linebacker duo, which was a major weak area that opponents specifically targeted last year. The first rounder from this draft, in Maryland's Deontay Banks, presents an impressive athletic and IQ profile at corner, who should start alongside Adoree Jackson and Daniel Holmes in nickel sets. I believe they look at Xavier McKinney as a franchise cornerstone on the last year of his rookie deal, but who do they want to start next to him? After letting Julian Love move on to Seattle in free agency, Jason Pinnock would be the most logical candidate to play deep safety, even though he actually played corner throughout his time in college and took a slight step back as his snaps doubled last season, coming over from the other New York team. Bobby McCain and Dane Belton to me are best suited in the slot, depending on if they prioritize man coverage skills or run defense from the spot. And 7th round Javarius Owens from Houston probably is most a designated special team at this year at least. However, they could still use a rangy player on the back end, so they can let the X-Men roam around a bit and drop down when they bring pressure, so you still have somebody help clean up if one of the receivers finds some early separation. For the Philadelphia Eagles, I put on Will linebacker. This may be the most complete roster in all football, and it's hard to poke many holes in it. Other than injury concerns throughout the running back room and a drop-off at safety, the main question marks are less based on personnel, but rather swapping out both coordinators, with quarterbacks coach Brian Johnson being elevated and being asked to simplify the attack in a similar way to Shane Steichen last year, which really allowed the talent to flourish, and Sean Desai's taking over the defense, which shouldn't look too different schematically. Up front, that unit should be pretty nasty, but I really feel his linebacker duo from last year in TJ Edwards and Kazir White was the most underrated part of the Eagles' Super Bowl run. The former provided a lot of stability between the tackles, with his ability to diagnose and fit against the run, while the latter provided plus range on the second level. I was very high on Kobe Dean in last year's draft, thanks to the instincts and intelligence he showed for the position at Georgia. However, he spent 10 times as many snaps on special teams as defense, where he had just 34 total during the regular season. So in terms of the pros, he's a fairly unproven asset, and you don't really have anybody next to him that I feel good about. Nicholas Moreau is currently slated to start on the weak side, but looking at his PFF grade of just 54.0, that ranked 86th among the 116 linebackers who played at least 100 snaps this past season. Across just over 1,000 career snaps for Sean Bradley, about 87% of those were spent on special teams, with 0 on defense in 2022. Christian Ellis has combined for just 29 total snaps on defense his last 2 years, and even Taylor is barely on the roster anymore due to poor play and injuries that originally got him released after his first 2 years as a former third-round pick. And finally, in terms of the NFC East, we're going to talk about the Washington Commanders, and the position for them is left guard. This is a team that sort of feels like it's at the calm point of an upcoming storm. Washington has now put together 3 straight seasons with 7 or 8 wins under Ron Rivera and moved on from Carson Wentz and Taylor Heineke at quarterback in order to see what they have from last year's 5th round pick Sam Howell, who for whatever reason they didn't really give any playing time to until the season finale, when he looked pretty damn good in the win over the Cowboys. So if he can take advantage of that opportunity, and from a broader perspective, if the team can take a step forward, that will decide if new ownership completely overhauls the decision makers within the organization, I believe. Meanwhile, Howell is certainly set up to make a strong case for himself, with one of the top wide receiver trios in the league, and Eric Bieniemy now calling the shots on offensive coordinator. How high they may fly will depend on his ability up front, where EB brought along Andrew Wiley from Kansas City to probably take over at right tackle and move third-year player Sam Cosmi one spot over. They also drafted Ricky Stromberg out of Arkansas at the end of the 3rd round, who I believe is the favorite now to start at center. That will probably lead to Nick Gates sliding over to left guard, where he's been a below average starter when asked to move there. Washington also drafted Braden Daniels out of Utah as a guy with tackle guard flexibility, while the other options are Deke Charles and Tyler Larson are also fringe roster candidates. A proven starter would move everybody else down one spot in the depth chart and allow you to only carry guys on game days that you actually feel okay about. That has us moving down south now, and we start things off with the Atlanta Falcons, and for them I put on a proven edge rusher. There's a lot to like about Atlanta heading into year 3 under head coach Arthur Smith. Even though purely by the win-loss total, they've posted back-to-back 7-10 records. This could be one of the most interesting offenses for football nerds like myself, because of the return of their ground-heavy approach, but they don't mind handing the ball off on 3rd and 3, yet they bring the new school flair of this incredibly interchangeable usage of personnel among the skill position group. Meanwhile, as they're moving on a defensive coordinator from the retired Dean Pease to former Saints D-line coach Ryan Nielsen, we should see a shift in terms of the front dynamics to a certain degree, while signing Jesse Bates in free agency as a rangy safety capable of playing center field, and trading minimal draft capital for former third overall pick Jeffrey Okudah from Detroit would indicate that we may see more single-high structures and man coverage on the perimeter. I actually outlined the Falcons' D-line as being one of the most improved position groups across the league, looking at the additions of veterans David Onyemata, Calais Campbell, and Bud Dupree, along with third-round pick Zach Harrison from Ohio State, and an undrafted free agent I believe has a chance to stick on the roster in Ekene Nwachukwu from Rice. With that being said, while we may see more even fronts with Campbell as a 6 technique defensive end, the only proven guy rushing off the edge is Lorenzo Carter, who he brought back for 2 more years at a $9 million price tag, but he's below the 10% rate that I'd like to see for any primary rusher in terms of pressures but passing down opportunity. Last year's second round pick Arnold Ebiketie did flash as a rookie, but played just below half of the defensive snaps and also didn't clear that mark. So unless Bud Dupree can suddenly find some flexibility in his banged up body to shorten the corner without relying on power solely, they don't really have anybody to do so in-house currently. Next up we got the Carolina Panthers, and for them I put on 4 eye or 5 technique defensive linemen. A breath of fresh air is swirling around Carolina these days, with a completely new coaching staff. With already one of the best young offensive lines in front of first overall pick Bryce Young, and Frank Reich's highly experienced coaching staff around him, we should finally see that unit be competent in both facets of the game. Defensively, they've already played at a very high level for stretches, with several underrated pieces in the front 7. What they've been missing most of, as opposing offenses started figuring out how to defeat the blitz packages former defensive coordinator Will Snow threw at them, and just in general what they've been needing to close out games is that guy across from Brian Burns, who can win rushing off the edge. However, Yetur Gross-Matos has been an excellent early down run defender, and they just traded up into the middle of the 3rd round for substantial resources in order to bring in Oregon's DJ Johnson, who I don't believe has really contributed a significant way yet, but has tremendous athletic potential. So as I think of the rest of the NFC South, using a lot more heavy personnel offensively than you see across most of the league, I expected to force Carolina to match with base quite a bit, even if new defensive coordinator Gio Evero in principle wants to live in light boxes. Derrick Brown really came into his own last season as a top 10 pick from 3 years ago, and they stole Shai Tuttle from within the division to give them a flexibility on the interior. However, the base defensive end spot that you'll find in 3-4 that ask players to play head up or shaded inside of the tackle is where they lack quality options. Deshaun Williams is currently slated to start there, but he's had back-to-back seasons with PFF grades right around 56 only. Beyond that, Henry Anderson has been plagued by injuries lately as a journeyman player, and then you're looking at undrafted free agents from the last 2 years in Marquand McCall and Jalen Redmond from Oklahoma. Nickelback is the position that I listed for the New Orleans Saints. Looking at the crowd that insists the cap isn't real, but Saints general manager Mickey Loomis has done throughout his tenure in the Big Easy is the first thing they can point towards. They've just continued to roll over money to future years and restructure contracts in order to maintain a competitive roster. The latest of those moves was handing quarterback Derek Carr a 4-year, $150 million deal, despite being nearly $60 million in the minus to begin the offseason in terms of effective cap space. Last year's first-round pick, Trevor Penning, needs to step in at left tackle, coming off injury, but more importantly, that defense needs to continue being one of the top units in the league in order to have a chance at competing with the elite teams in the NFC. More than in years prior, they're relying on young players up front to give them quality play, as 2 top 40 picks from this past April may end up starting for them eventually. The back 7 stays pretty much intact, although there will be a battle for that second starting outside corner spot between Paulson Adebo, who took a step back in year 2, and Alontae Taylor, who I don't believe the grading or pure numbers represent how well he performed over the latter half of his rookie campaign. Regardless, neither one of them spent any extended stretch in the slot, where they let the long-term veteran and Chris Harris Jr. walk, and now his former Denver teammate Bradley Roby is currently slated to be the starter. That's not super encouraging, however, as he's coming off the worst season of his 9-year career and has an overall missed tackle rate of nearly 18%, which doesn't compensate for his declining quality and coverage. As for alternatives, Lonnie Johnson Jr. played less than 200 snaps for Bangor Titans secondary last season, and Ugo Amadi spent time in 3 different cities in 2022. And my choice for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is receiver depth, just about half a year away from the Bucs winning this division somewhat by default, as they took care of business down a stretch with Tom Brady at the helm. They seem to be the clear 4th team in this equation, while the early signs of a battle at quarterback between Baker Mayfield, Kyle Trask, and maybe even Joel Wolford have not been too encouraging, and I wonder who starts at nickel for them defensively, which I actually mentioned in Undrafted Free Agent as a potential solution in a prior article if you want to check that out. You could argue that a lot of the key pieces from the Super Bowl run just 2.5 years ago are still there. That includes wide receivers Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, while the third slot has transitioned from Antonio Brown, who threw up the deuces on his NFL career midway through the following season, to Russell Gage on a $10 million per year contract, being signed for agency last March. We can argue if Big Mike's prime is finally winding down to some degree, and if Chris Godwin can return to the type of physical pass catcher he was prior to damaging multiple ligaments in his knee in December of 2021. But in theory, that is still a very likable trio of weapons, especially if Cade Otton can build on a strong late season run as a rookie tight end. Where things look a bit bare is beyond those starters in 11 personnel. Looking at the collection of wide receivers currently on the roster, Devin Tompkins had 5 catches as a rookie, primarily contributing on the return game, and Kalen Geiger didn't have any. David Moore had a nice 3-year stretch in Seattle, but after signing a 2-year deal in Carolina ahead of 2021, he was released before the season started, and was only active for 3 games with 0 catches across 4 other teams since then. Otherwise, it's all UDFAs on the roster. Which has us moving on to the final division for today, the NFC West. First up we got the Arizona Cardinals, and the position here clearly for me is center. Unless you're a hardcore NFL fan like me, and maybe even then if you haven't really studied rosters across the league this offseason, I'd like to challenge you to name the current starter at center for the Cardinals. Nothing? Well, don't feel bad for not getting Hjalte Frohold's name right. He was another one of those New England 4th rounders 3 years ago, considering they just drafted 3 guys in the range this past April. Since then, he's been waived by the Patriots, the Texans, and the Browns, in part due to ultimately landing on the reserve list for all of them. This offseason, a week after releasing Rodney Hudson, who was already contemplating retirement at that point, Arizona signed Froholt to a 2-year, $2.6 million contract. And looking at the 5 games he started at the pivot in Cleveland last year, surrounded by a couple of Pro Bowl guards, I might add, his average PFF grade across those was just 55.8. The reason a player like that, who hadn't started a game until the Browns were dealing with injuries, can even get a deal above the veteran minimum, is that the Cardinals were kind of desperate, not having a single school center on the roster. In fact, the only interior offensive lineman, other than Will Hernandez currently on the contract, who didn't get drafted on day 3 in either one of these past 2 years, is journeyman Elijah Wilkinson, who has never played a single snap at center, and of those young guys I just mentioned, the only one with any pro experience, looked pretty damn rough and pushed into action last year. I did like Lester Smith and Marquis Hayes as late round flyers for this group from 2022, but you better hope Froholt steps up his game and is able to stay healthy. And even then, I would not be comfortable with that being plan A. For the Los Angeles Rams, I put defense around Aaron Donald, and I know this sounds a bit excessive, but please look at the Rams depth chart on defense and tell me you didn't either smirk or raise your eyebrows reading through all those names. If you do so on Owlights.com, the amount of green, which indicates rookies, across the second and third string is just wild. Overall, the fact that Sean McVay and Raheem Morris are coming back to lead both sides of the ball forward are major benefits. Looking at where the strategy of stars and scrubs oriented roster constructions led them. However, there's a lot more to work with offensively if the O-line can come together with some young and hopefully healthy pieces. Because the defense is experiencing a complete overhaul, as the only 3 players even left from the championship run are Aaron Donald, Ernest Jones, and Jordan Fuller, which a lot of 2 of those are on the 3rd and final years of the rookie contracts respectively. Kobe Durant had some nice flashes as a playmaking slot cornerback, and Quentin Lake showed some of the high-level instincts and intelligence that I liked at UCLA late in the year as safety, after missing almost the entire rookie campaign with a knee injury. However, beyond that, there's very little to hang your hat on, with major question marks at all 3 levels. If I had to choose one specific position, it would be boundary cornerback. I think with a guy like Darren Kendrick, who was selected out of Georgia in the 6th round last year, and according to most depth charts, is supposed to start for them. You really limit what you can do schematically, considering he ran the high 4.7s at his pro day. I believe a 4th rounder from 2 years ago, in Robert Rochelle, presents a pretty high variance profile in terms of coverage and tackling, and the one guy I'd feel okay about getting extended run for them is this year's 6th rounder Trey Hartis Tomlinson from TCU, but at 5'8", 180 pounds, he's probably a pure nickel in the pros. Starting to wind down now with the San Francisco 49ers, and I thought a proven right tackle would still help them out a lot. First and foremost, this 49ers roster is loaded. If you really want to go through it, there aren't too many weaknesses or even question marks that you can find. Of course, we'll need to see how this whole triangle of quarterbacks plays out, and they're probably depending on the 3rd round pick Jaya Brown to give them quality plays as starting safety right away. But I do think he's a great fit for that defense, and the reports out of camp have all been good. So even right tackle, I'd say, isn't like a position that I'll look at as a definite hole for them. If Matt Pryor is mostly looked at as a designated backup and left tackle, and you want to let one of the young guys earn that gig on the opposite end, it'll just be filled with an unproven commodity, as Colton McKivitz, Jalen Moore and Nick Sakelsch are competing for it. The first among those names is the one who's been part of the system the longest, entering year 4 in San Francisco. He did play 300 snaps at right guard as a rookie, but has only logged 29 total at right tackle so far, with underwhelming results overall. Moore is somebody I really liked as another 5th rounder from 2 years ago, and he's filled in pretty well for Trent Williams on the left side when needed, but literally his 2 worst graded PFF games, among the 8 in which he played 10 plus snaps, came when he lined up on the opposite end. And finally, Sakelsch was looked at as a transition candidate to guard anyway, considering he only has 32.5-inch arms, and he only played 12 snaps as a 6th round rookie last year. The way Kyle Shanahan can mask weaknesses across the O-line should mitigate the worries that Spot may bring along, but if they fall behind in the game and any of those dudes have to protect against top-flight edge rushers, that could spell trouble. And the final team now of this edition is the one that is kind of being slept on, I believe, when looking at the betting markets. For the Seattle Seahawks, I put on nose tackle. The Hawks were looked at as a rebuilding program last offseason, once they traded Russell Wilson to Denver. However, that offense actually improved under the new leadership of Geno Smith, and with the additions of Ohio State's wide receiver Jackson Smith-Njigba and UCLA running back Zach Charbonnet, they've really built out a skill position group. Defensively is where things kind of fell apart for them last season, as they really struggled to stop the run and get home with a fairly improved group of pass rushers. They handed free agent Draymond Jones $51.3 million over the next 3 years, as a guy who can play some base ends in even fronts and be a versatile piece in passing downs. If Uchenna Nwosu can replicate what he did over the second half of last season as one of the most consistent pressure players off the edge, and they collectively get quality play on the opposite end between the 3 second rounders they've now spent on the position, I think we could see that unit be a lot more disruptive, especially with a tremendous young duo of corners into Rick Woolen and now 5th overall pick Devon Witherspoon. Where I'm still worried is how to get to those longer down distances, and in particular the very middle of the defense. Brian Moan is the only true nose at that roster, who's had an average PFF grade of 53.3 across his 4 seasons in Seattle, where he's combined for just over 1,000 snaps, in large part due to injuries to the frontline starters. Cameron Young is a 4th round rookie, was a part-time A-gap defender for Mississippi State, but optimally plays more so 3-4 defensive ends, and I recently outlined Jonah Tavai as a potential impact UDFA out of San Diego State, who did line up as a shade 1 technique at times, but in a role where he just crashed through the center's shoulder rather than ever having to read and react. That's gonna do it for the NFC side of things though. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to hit the thumbs up, subscribe for future episodes if you haven't done so yet, and if you could share the channel with a friend or two, I'd really appreciate that. Make sure to let me know in the comments if there's a player you'd still like your team to add, and as you can tell, I started putting some live music in the background. Would love some feedback on that too. As I mentioned at the start, you can browse through my divisional draft and roster review series here on YouTube if you want my analysis on every single player selected by your favorite team and the approach they've taken to roster construction. And last week I published a written piece on the most improved position groups across the league. The link to my page helloswithfootballtalk.com is down below in the description, along with my social media handles if you want to stay up to date with everything I do. Otherwise, I hope to see you back here next week for the second half of this series as we dive into the AFC. So until then, see you later. Peace!